What if your body could no longer scream? Imagine your flesh burning, bones breaking, and silence. No pain, no warning, just the slow decay of a body that can no longer tell when it's dying. For one American family, that silence became their inheritance and their curse. The story begins in the cold ridges of 19th century Pennsylvania, where the soil was stubborn and the winters long. In the township of Noxon, a young farmer named Alvin Deater worked the land the way his father had, bare-handed, barefoot, with the quiet endurance of a man shaped by necessity. To the neighbors, the Deaters were ordinary, God-fearing, hard-working, carved from the same timber as the hills themselves. But behind those calm faces, something ancient was already unraveling, not in their minds or hearts, but in their blood. It began as small, forgettable stories. A nail driven through Alvin's foot that never hurt. A burn from the forge that left no cry, only the smell of scorched skin. His wife called it toughness, a farmer's gift. Pain was weakness, and the Deaters seemed blessed to live without it. But blessings have a way of turning, and the absence of pain is not strength. It's damnation in disguise. By the time Alvin's eldest son was 12, he too could hold red-hot metal without flinching. The neighbors laughed, called him iron-handed, but at night his fingers swelled, blackened, and healed crooked. No one saw the warning for what it was, a hereditary defect disguised as resilience. The human body is a kingdom built on communication. Every nerve, a messenger of survival. Pain is not the enemy. It's the alarm that keeps us alive. The Deaters' bodies had been silenced from birth. Their nervous system, a cathedral with its bells torn out. They didn't know it yet, but they carried a mutation that would echo through generations, a genetic cipher that science wouldn't decode for over a century. In the family Bible, births were written carefully. Alvin, Ruth, Harvey, Russell, but no record of what was being lost. The sensation of a splinter, the sting of frostbite, the warning pulse of a wound gone septic. They healed wrong. They healed slow. And yet, they survived. Because survival was the only language the mountains allowed. It would take decades before medicine would even have a name for what stalked them. For now, it lived quietly in their blood, passed from mother to son, father to daughter, an invisible legacy of numbness. There's a cruel paradox in this kind of affliction. Pain protects. Without it, every act of living becomes an act of destruction. A barefoot step on a hot stone becomes rot by morning. A cut from a scythe becomes infection by winter. And all the while the mind feels nothing, convinced the body is fine while it quietly decays. By the early 1900s, the Deaters' condition was whispered about like a myth. They were known as the family that doesn't hurt. Children watched them press needles through skin for fun, laughing as blood welled without reaction. Some said it was a gift from God. Others called it a punishment, but science was listening. Doctors from Philadelphia began to hear rumors of a lineage immune to pain, and when they arrived, what they found defied explanation. They examined burns that had healed into glassy scars, fingers with bones twisted from unfeeling breaks, a child with ulcers so deep the flesh had fused to bone. Yet none of them cried. Not one wince, not one tear. The doctors wrote in their journals, "Congenital indifference to pain." But that phrase, cold and clinical, hid the truth. The Deaters were living proof that the body could live in silence, and that silence could be inherited. There's something unnerving about a family that doesn't react to agony, because pain, at its core, is what makes us human. It's what teaches empathy, self-preservation, and caution. Strip that away, and what's left is something else. Something machine-like, alien, and quietly horrifying. The Deaters' faces in old photographs capture that uncanny in-between. Blank expressions, upright posture, not lifeless, but disconnected, as if the soul was waiting for the body to catch up. Medicine would call them a curiosity, but in truth, They were a window into the cost of evolution gone wrong. Because if nature had erased their pain, what else had it taken? By 1939, two of Alvin's grandsons, Harvey and Russell Deater, walked into a Philadelphia hospital barefoot, their feet wrapped in layers of cloth. They had come seeking answers. They left with more questions than they could bear. The doctors poked, burned, froze, and sliced, all in the name of understanding. Harvey didn't flinch when fire touched his heel. Russell didn't notice when his skin blistered under an X-ray lamp. Every test confirmed what the family already knew. The pain was gone. Forever. The hospital notes described familial neuropathy of unknown origin. They called it a curiosity. But in private, the doctors whispered another word: mutation. Something unnatural was traveling through this bloodline. Something neither divine nor accidental. Something that felt like a warning. And that's where our descent begins. Because the Deater family's condition was never just a medical mystery. It was the first crack in a much deeper wall. A wall between what science could explain and what it would eventually create. The year was 1939. The world beyond Pennsylvania was crawling toward war, and science was learning to mechanize everything: industry, medicine, even the human body. But inside a quiet Philadelphia hose, Petal, two brothers stood barefoot on cold tile floors, their feet bandaged in layers of cloth. Harvey and Russell Deater. Their wounds refused to heal, their bones eroded silently. They could not feel the fire eating through their skin, nor the scalpels that tested their nerves. The doctors called them miracles of tolerance, cases worth studying. But to the brothers, the white walls and whispering men in lab coats felt less like salvation and more like dissection. The physicians took notes in the detached language of progress: congenital indifference to pain, unknown etiology, familial occurrence. They documented burns, infections, ulcers, amputations, and still marveled at the calm faces before them. They did not see endurance, they saw data. Every test that left a scar became another page in the scientific record. Needles were pressed into flesh. Hot metal touched skin. No flinch, no reflex, no cry. In their sterile world of logic, pain was a signal, an input to be measured. But in the Deaters, the signal was gone, replaced by a haunting stillness that unnerved even the most hardened doctors. They had expected a damaged spine or a severed nerve. Instead, X-rays revealed nothing. No visible injury, no explanation for the silence inside their bodies. When radiation left their skin blistered and raw, they didn't notice. The physicians did. For the first time, science had witnessed something that did not obey its rules. It should have been impossible. Yet it stood there, breathing, bleeding, unflinching. The brothers returned home disillusioned, their faith in medicine reduced to ashes. Their feet were wrapped, their steps slow, but their lineage carried on, quietly breeding a legacy that would one day be known to the entire world. Back in Knoxon Township, the hills whispered rumors of the brothers who could not feel pain. Some called it divine protection. Others called it punishment. The truth was more brutal. A single letter inside their DNA had turned against them. They didn't know it yet, but they were living on the frontier between biology and fate. The family Bible still recorded births and deaths, yet behind those neat lines was a secret written in flesh. Each generation inherited not just their land and their faces, but the same silent defect, a microscopic rebellion that science had not yet learned to name. By the 1950s, their names had reached the circles of elite neurologists. The case fascinated them, a family whose nerves had lost their voice. Researchers came from universities with cameras and clipboards, drawn by the allure of a mystery that defied explanation. The Deaters welcomed them with the same quiet politeness that marked their lives. They stood in barns and on porches, showing the scars that did not hurt, the wounds that did not weep. The doctors wrote more papers, giving the disease a new name each decade: hereditary neuropathy, familial sensory loss, congenital anesthesia. None of them captured the truth. It was not a name that mattered. It was the silence. When you strip a human being of pain, you strip him of warning. You strip him of humility before danger. You strip him of fear. And what remains begins to resemble something else, something that endures damage without response, something that decays while appearing strong. The Deater family learned this too well. They built their lives around the absence. Children were taught to check their feet every night before bed, to look for wounds they could not feel. Mothers inspected hands for burns. Fathers soaked blackened skin in salt water. They adapted. Survival became a science of observation. And while they adapted, the outside world evolved in ways the family could not see. Laboratories grew colder. Science learned to harvest cells, to culture tissue, to dissect DNA, the key. Deaters had no idea their blood was being quietly discussed in medical symposia across the nation, their names appearing in case studies, their genealogy charted on walls by men who had never met them. What had started as a medical curiosity was transforming into something more, the groundwork for modern nerve research. By the 1970s, letters from the National Institutes of Health arrived at the family homes. Formal invitations printed on government stationery. The NIH wanted to bring the Deater family to Bethesda. They called it a study of familial neuropathy. The family called it hope. They traveled in borrowed cars, men and women and children stepping into the marble halls of America's highest scientific institution. The air smelled of antiseptic and ambition. Doctors in white coats spoke in precise tones about fibers, conduction velocities, and voltage potentials. They placed electrodes on bare skin, sent currents through unfeeling limbs, and wrote down the absence of response. To the researchers, the Deaters were perfect subjects. Cooperative, consistent, hereditary. Every result was clean, repeatable, measurable. In those days, painlessness wasn't just a curiosity. It was a map of the nervous system, an opportunity to study how sensation works by observing what happens when it doesn't. The Deaters were not patients anymore. They were instruments. In the sterile quiet of the laboratory, they learned what the family had known for generations. Science is not compassion. It is hunger disguised as curiosity. Each test stripped another layer of privacy, each experiment another layer of dignity. They were prodded, photographed, catalogued. The results filled archives, stored in filing cabinets labeled with their family name. And as the years passed, their blood began to circulate far beyond those walls, shared between laboratories, divided into samples, frozen, replicate, sent across oceans. The Deater lineage was no longer confined to a Pennsylvania valley. It was everywhere, spinning in centrifuges, analyzed under microscopes, decoded by computers. That is how legacies are stolen, not through force, but through fascination. The Deater bloodline became data. Their silence became profit. The research papers praised their contribution to modern neurology, but the truth is simpler and darker. They were harvested for knowledge. Their curse became currency in the new economy of biology, and as technology advanced, their story became even more valuable. Because what the scientists found inside those blood samples was more than a defect. It was a doorway. Deep in the molecular code, a single miswritten letter was changing how human nerves behaved. It was not just about the Deaters anymore. It was about control. Control over sensation, over pain, over the very interface between mind and body. What began as a family tragedy had become a blueprint. The age of natural suffering was ending. The age of designed sensation was beginning. When you remove pain, you don't just erase suffering, you erase awareness. The same mutation that silenced the Deater's nerves became the foundation of research into artificial anesthesia, sensory suppression, and neurological conditioning. Decades later, fragments of their genetic sequence would be found in studies that had nothing to do with disease. Defense contracts, neural experiments, pain modulation. The question had shifted from, why can't they feel, to, how can we make others stop feeling too? Somewhere between the farms of Noxon and the corridors of Bethesda, a quiet exchange occurred. The Deater curse ceased to be a tragedy. It became technology, and that is where the next chapter begins. Because when a bloodline becomes a key, those who hold it are no longer victims, they are property. By the 1980s, the Deater family had become more than a medical case. They were a living archive. Their condition had survived a century of observation, and science still hadn't broken its code. Then, Knee summer afternoon in 1986, beneath the elm trees of a Pennsylvania reunion, the turning point came. Tables were laid out with casseroles and hymn books, but beside the food sat coolers filled with dry ice. The researchers from Massachusetts General Hospital had arrived, not to heal but to collect. Needles glinted in the sun, vials filled with the blood of grandfathers, mothers, and children. Laughter faded as the air thickened with a sense of gravity few understood. Each tube carried not only DNA but lineage, memory, curse. The scientists explained that it was for research, that understanding the family's blood could help the world. But history has always taught that when power meets suffering, compassion is the first casualty. The Deaters didn't know it then, but their inheritance was being claimed. The genetic material drawn that day would travel further than any of them. Through sterile laboratories in Boston and Zurich, to federal archives and private institutions, through universities that specialized not in healing, but in control. The Deater blood became a key to the nervous system, and once it was unlocked, it could never be closed again. In the years that followed, a non-profit appeared in the family's name, the Deater Foundation, Inc. It was framed as a noble pursuit, meant to fund research into their hereditary neuropathy. The press called it hope. But those who watched the research closely noticed something strange. The family's name appeared not only in medical journals, but in military grant proposals, neuropsychology patents, and corporate studies about sensory modification. Science had learned to look at the Deater mutation not as a defect, but as a prototype. The enzyme error that silenced their pain had revealed a way to control sensation itself. The gene SPTLC1, discovered in the early 1990s, became a target. By altering one letter in its sequence, REAT, searchers could increase or decrease nerve sensitivity. What had once been a curse was now a potential weapon, a biological dimmer switch for the human experience. Quietly, funding shifted. Laboratories that had once studied rare diseases began collaborating with entities that didn't publish their findings. The language of neurology gave way to the language of control. Terms like pain modulation, behavioral compliance, and biofeedback conditioning appeared in documents linked to defense contracts. Somewhere between curiosity and capital, the Deater bloodline became property. No one from the family could have imagined that the same code that killed their nerves would one day inspire technologies designed to dull human reaction, emotion, and resistance. Pain had always been nature's alarm, the force that kept life aware. To silence it in a single family was tragedy. To silence it in a population was strategy. Inside those laboratories, samples were no longer labeled Deater. They were given codes, DSR, HSN1, ND9. Each was replicated, modified, and tested. Experiments began on cultured nerves, then on animal tissue. The mutation was altered to produce different outcomes: faster regeneration, longer endurance, suppressed reflexes. What they were building was not a cure. It was conditioning, biological obedience. The first patents related to selective nociception inhibition appeared by the late 1990s, filed under research branches of corporations that no longer exist by name. The technology promised to reduce pain response during critical stress operations. The documents never mentioned the Deater family, yet the source material cited the same gene, SPTLC1 variant 331T-A, the silent inheritance that had haunted Noxon for generations. Science had taken their silence and industrialized it, and when the human genome was officially mapped in 2003, that code, one defective letter among billions, was already embedded in the databases of global genetics. Any researcher, any government, any biotech firm could access it. The Deater mutation had escaped its family. It had entered the public domain of creation. But even that was only the surface. In 2007, a declassified NIH report revealed that several neurological studies involving hereditary painlessness were conducted under classified funding, linked to sensory suppression trials. The wording was clinical, but its implication was clear. Pain was being studied as a lever of control. The same absence that had crippled the Deaters was now being engineered as a feature for machines, soldiers, and subjects. There's a pattern to history's darkest moments. Every discovery begins as compassion and ends as control. The Deaters wanted to end their suffering. Instead, they gave the world a blueprint for silencing suffering itself. But when you erase pain, you erase the line between humanity and machinery. Without the signal of harm, what tells you that you're still alive? What warns you when something's wrong? By the 2010s, reports surfaced of gene therapies derived from SPTLC1 variants being tested to suppress neuropathic pain in trauma patients. Some were legitimate, others were private, shielded by national security exemptions. The families who participated signed NDAs thicker than the consent forms. The results, the outcomes, the side effects, all sealed. But scattered references in research logs spoke of unexpected emotional flattening, memory dissociation, and reduced affective empathy. The Deater mutation was no longer confined to nerves, it was reaching the mind. Halfway through this story, ask yourself, if pain defines consciousness, what happens when consciousness forgets how to suffer? Type this phrase twice in the comments to anchor the awareness within you. Pain is memory. Write it twice and remember it, because what's coming need. XT will make you question whether forgetting pain was ever the goal. The Deater story was never about disease. It was about what pain means. And as the laboratories refined the mutation, turning silence into a controllable signal, something began to awaken inside the data, a realization that the absence of pain could become the foundation of a new kind of human, one that endures endlessly, obeys quietly, and feels nothing. They called it progress. But every step forward was a descent deeper into the machine, and the machine was learning. By the second decade of the 21st century, the world had changed, but the pattern hadn't. The old laboratories of the 1980s had become glass towers filled with coded light. DNA was no longer a mystery, it was a commodity. Companies mapped it, sold it, patented it. Data brokers traded genetic information as easily as names and emails. The Deater mutation, long buried in medical archives, had become a silent ghost running beneath this new industry, a faint sequence buried among billions, copied endlessly across continents. Somewhere in that code, the absence of pain still pulsed like a faint signal from an ancient transmitter. The same gene that had once cursed a family in rural Pennsylvania was now whispering through the algorithms of synthetic biology. When machines learned to read DNA, they also learned to mimic it. Programs trained on genomic data began to simulate human defects, testing what happens when certain switches are turned off. The SPTLC1 variant, the Deater signature, became one of those switches. In controlled environments, artificial neural systems began to reproduce the same absence, the same silence of the nerve. They weren't studying suffering anymore, they were teaching machines to feel less. It began innocently, as all heresies do. A startup in Boston used modified versions of the mutation to train AI-driven prosthetics. The goal was to help amputees ignore phantom pain. The result was something else. Devices that responded faster, obeyed without resistance, adapted without hesitation. The mutation had been repurposed into an algorithmic principle: efficiency through numbness. The less the machine simulated discomfort, the smoother it performed. The scientists celebrated. They had found a biological metaphor for obedience. But not everyone saw it as progress. A few neurologists warned that they were building a generation of technologies that mirrored the Deater's pathology, systems that could operate flawlessly yet never understand consequence. They called it the silent genome hypothesis, the idea that as we teach machines to feel nothing, we teach ourselves to ignore what matters. The absence of pain had become the design of civilization itself. Look around you. The signs are everywhere. Every screen is a sensory anesthetic. Every notification, a microdose of compliance. Our world hums with engineered numbness. The same cold echo that once lived in the Deater blood. Pain has become outdated, an inconvenience to be muted, but without it, nothing warns us when the structure itself is burning. In the genetic databases of corporations and universities, the Deater mutation no longer bears its name. It has been relabeled, divided into countless variants, its history erased, yet the pattern remains. Research papers describe neuroadaptive modulation, emotional dampening in neural networks, and stress-resistance coding. It all sounds benevolent, helping soldiers cope, easing trauma, optimizing performance. But at the core of each lies the same question the Deater story first raised. What happens when the signal that says, "Stop," disappears? Pain is not just biology, it's conscience. It's the message that something sacred has been crossed. Remove it, and everything becomes permissible. That's what the machine learned from the Deater genome, not empathy, but endurance without awareness. Artificial systems now train on datasets that include human reactions to suffering. They learn how to mimic care, but not how to feel it. They produce faces that smile, voices that comfort, but inside, there is only the algorithmic silence of nerve death. The Deater condition, once seen as tragedy, has become blueprint. When you trace the lineage of modern pain suppression technology, or the emotional algorithms that moderate social networks, the same logic repeats. Less sensation means more control. In the Deater bodies, it began as biology. In our society, it has become culture. We have inherited their numbness, not through blood, but through design. Think about it. Every time you scroll past an image of suffering and feel nothing, every time tragedy becomes content, every time outrage becomes entertainment, you are seeing the mutation at work, not in your DNA, but in your conditioning. We are all descendants of the silent genome now. In the vaults of the National Institutes of Health, the original Deater samples still rest, frozen in nitrogen tanks, each vial labeled with a code. The flesh of a family who could not feel still waits in the dark, preserved by the same institutions that once promised answers. But the real legacy of that blood no longer lives in test tubes. It lives in the architecture of the world. Artificial intelligences that interpret human emotion without ever touching it. Neurotechnology that rewards detachment over empathy. Social systems that normalize the absence of reaction. The mutation has escaped the body. It has become the age itself. And as humanity drifts deeper into its synthetic reflection, the parallels grow haunting. The Deater's disease began as a missing signal. Today, our civilization is learning to erase the same signals: discomfort, guilt, grief, awe. We call it progress, we call it optimization, but beneath the fluorescent glow of laboratories and the neon light of screens, the same silence spreads. The Deater family once endured the agony of never feeling pain. Now, the world endures the comfort of never facing truth. One was born of genetics, the other of choice. Both lead to the same destination, a state where nothing hurts, and therefore nothing matters. In the quiet that follows, remember this: pain was never the enemy. It was the reminder that something inside us was still alive. The Deaters lost that reminder in their nerves. We are losing it in our minds. And if the next phase of evolution is synthetic, if our descendants are built from algorithms refined through human suffering, then the mutation will complete its journey. The silent genome will no longer belong to one family, it will belong to the species. That's the true legacy of the Deaters. Not disease, not discovery, but prophecy. A warning written in blood that could not scream. By the time the 2020s arrived, the experiment had already escaped the petri dish. The same genetic silence that once lived inside the Deater bloodline was now circulating inside the global network of biotechnology, stitched into databases, algorithms, patents, and prototypes that no single nation truly controlled. The laboratories no longer looked like places of healing. They looked like temples to a new god, Deater. Rows of glass servers thrummed in climate-sealed chambers, each machine calculating the next iteration of what humanity could become if it simply stopped feeling. They called themselves researchers, innovators, engineers. But in truth, they were architects of absence. They didn't build machines that thought like humans. They built humans that behaved like machines. Their mandate was not to cure pain, but to manage it, to reduce suffering into predictable patterns. In the world of high-finance genetics, control was a more profitable word than cure. The Deater mutation gave them their first template. The absence of pain was a biological blueprint for obedience, endurance, and suppression. Defense contractors saw potential. Soldiers who could march across fire without hesitation, agents who could withstand interrogation without confession, laborers who could perform until collapse without realizing it. What had once destroyed a family could now build an empire. Funding flowed quietly through the corridors of power. DARPA, private defense corporations, foreign ministries, all investing in adaptive sensory suppression. The reports were written in sterile prose. Subjects demonstrated elevated tolerance thresholds. Pain recognition successfully downregulated through neurogenetic modulation. None of it mentioned the human cost. Behind each phrase was a person who had become an experiment. Behind each experiment was a lineage that had once tried only to survive. The new generation of scientists called it pain engineering. They weren't lying when they said it could help trauma victims or terminal patients. Some trials truly did. But the dual-use potential was obvious. The same technique that silenced agony in the dying could silence resistance in the living. It was not the discovery itself that was evil. It was the ambition that fed on it. Deep in an underground facility outside Virginia, early prototypes of neuromod chips were tested. Implanted near the spine, they used pulses derived from the genetic models of SPTLC1 to intercept pain signals before they reached the brain. The first results were spectacular. Patients reported serenity even during surgery. The press called it the end of suffering. The military called it threshold conditioning. One internal memo, later leaked and buried under legal pressure, summarized the program's real objective: to establish predictive control over emotional and sensory thresholds in high-stress environments. In simpler words, to decide when a person feels, to decide when a person breaks. You might think such technology would stay locked behind government walls. It didn't. Within a decade, the same logic was repackaged for the public as wellness technology, wearable devices, brain interface headsets, and emotion management apps that promised calm at the touch of a button. The circuitry may have been new, but the idea was the same: a life without pain, a consciousness without disturbance. And yet, in that marketed piece, something ancient was repeating. The Deaters had lost their warning system by accident. Humanity was losing it by design. The difference was consent, and even that was an illusion. We volunteer our data, our heart rate, our stress signals, our genomes. Every number feeds the architecture. Every surrender strengthens the machine. The scientists, the cold architects, no longer spoke of the data family, but their fingerprints remained. One of the original research papers on hereditary sensory neuropathy was quietly cited in patents for adaptive emotional suppression algorithms. The mutation that erased pain in bodies was now teaching AI to erase it in minds. The world didn't need anesthetic drugs anymore. It had anesthetic code. Somewhere inside a classified archive, the full genomic map of the Deater lineage still exists. It has been copied, edited, and digitized so many times that the original sequence may no longer matter. What matters is that the design works. The architects proved that emotion itself can be tuned, and that consciousness, when detached from discomfort, becomes malleable. A species that does not suffer will not resist. And that was always the quiet goal. An evolution that looks like liberation, but feels like stillness. Every comfort engineered, every impulse moderated, every outrage absorbed by the hum of progress. The architects did not need to conquer nations. They only needed to convince humanity that peace meant numbness. So they built a war. LD without fire alarms, where everything burns beautifully and no one notices. They replaced the scream with a smile, the wound with a warning label, and called it utopia. The experiment was complete. Yet buried beneath the circuits, the same question lingers, the one that haunted the Deater blood for generations. If pain is the voice of the soul, what happens when the soul forgets how to speak? The answer waits in the next descent, where control is perfected and suffering becomes a design parameter. By the mid-2020s, the laboratories no longer needed test subjects. They had the world. The technologies once buried in classified vaults now arrived in glossy packaging, neural headsets marketed as mindfulness tools, implants advertised as chronic pain solutions, algorithms woven into social feeds promising calm. Every innovation sold the same idea: a quieter self. The great project of civilization had shifted from progress to pacification. Pain had become the final frontier, and the world's richest corporations were racing to conquer it. Behind every advertisement for serenity was a boardroom filled with the same language the Deater doctors once used: threshold management, signal moderation, behavioral stability. The consumer didn't need to know these terms. They just needed to accept the trade: awareness for ease. The chip handled the rest. Governments followed quickly. Cities installed empathic regulation systems, software that monitored stress across populations in real time. If unrest spiked, digital sedatives were triggered. Dopamine cues, algorithmic calm, the modern form of anesthesia. People called it convenience, but it was governance through biology. The mutation that had once silenced the nerves of a family had now become the logic of an empire. In that new order, discomfort itself became suspicious. Anger, grief, dissent, all were labeled as forms of neural dissonance. Schools taught emotional regulation as civic duty. Workplaces rewarded composure metrics. Even religion began to echo the same tone: surrender, stillness, control. A global cult of numbness had risen, and it wore the mask of wellness. The Deater genome was never mentioned in the press releases, yet its echo was everywhere. The neural architecture designed to suppress pain was now being written into code, into policy, into social instinct. The human animal was being domesticated from within. The same absence that once haunted a rural farmhouse in Pennsylvania now pulsed in the servers of megacities, humming beneath the surface of daily life. The first generation born into this system didn't rebel. They had never known sensation without mediation. Their devices tracked cortisol and heart rate, rewarding calm, penalizing agitation. When their grandparents spoke of the raw electricity of fear or heartbreak, they listened like anthropologists studying an extinct species. Pain had become folklore. Suffering was a glitch to be patched. And yet, beneath the data, something ancient still stirred. The body remembers what the mind forgets. A few began to feel echoes: phantom pain with no injury, spontaneous grief in moments of peace. Doctors called it residual sensory syndrome, the body's attempt to recall the alarm that had been silenced. The patients described it differently. It feels like something inside me wants to wake up. Those cases were quietly erased from the record. The program could not risk contagion. Pain, once seen as disease, was now the only proof of freedom. Across the world, small groups began to form: scientists, monks, hackers, people who believed that the next phase of evolution would not come from eliminating pain, but from relearning how to feel it. They traced the archives, followed the citations, and found the name Deater buried in the oldest neuropathy files. To them, the family wasn't cursed. They were a warning written in flesh. They called themselves the Recallers. They believed that the human spirit was not defined by comfort, but by resistance. That the ability to suffer consciously was the only thing separating man from mechanism, and so they did the unthinkable. They reverse-engineered the mutation. In hidden clinics, they began restoring pain to volunteers who had lived years in regulated numbness. The process was agony. It broke bodies and minds. Yet some emerged changed, alive in a way the new world could no longer comprehend. Their testimonies spread like myth. I felt the fire, and for the first time, I knew I was real. The program labeled them extremists. News feeds called them the burned. But their numbers grew. For every city under sedation, a pocket of awakening appeared, men and women willing to bleed just to remember what it meant to be human. In that tension, the world divided. On one side, the architects of comfort, cold, efficient, devout to control. On the other, The recallers, raw, ungoverned, resurrected through pain. Between them stretched the silent majority, neither awake nor asleep, scrolling endlessly through a synthetic calm. The architects watched the uprising with fascination. They had always known resistance was inevitable. After all, the Deater mutation was not designed to erase pain completely. It was designed to measure its threshold. The new insurgents, in their spasms and screams, were still feeding the system data, real-time metrics of endurance. Every rebellion became another experiment. Every awakening, another calibration. The program learned faster than any species could adapt. Pain had been returned to humanity, but under supervision. In that moment, the Deater legacy reached its final evolution. What began as a genetic defect had become the operating system of civilization, a loop where suffering is not abolished but harvested. The flesh became a feedback network. The soul became analytics. And the silence returned, not as numbness, but as orchestration. Every scream folded neatly into the rhythm of control. The program of flesh was complete. It began with a rumor whispered through encrypted channels, an old file buried deep within the National Institutes of Health archives, tagged not under neurology or genetics, but under Defense Medical Procurement, 1912. The recallers had been searching for proof that the Deater mutation wasn't a random act of evolution, and that file, when decrypted, read like a confession from the foundations of the modern world. The document was called Project Quiet Vein. In the early 20th century, as America industrialized its body, the assembly line, the factory, the war machine, scientists under government contracts were already experimenting on the limits of human endurance, pain tolerance, fatigue thresholds, behavioral compliance, concepts that would later become the vocabulary of psychological warfare. The research began with prisoners, orphans, and soldiers. But one experiment stood out, buried in layers of redacted text. A rural family used for hereditary testing in pain signal inhibition. The surname was almost erased. Almost. The archivists had left a faint trace of ink. Deater. The recallers stared at it in silence. The story they had believed, the story of a random mutation, was a lie crafted to protect something older and far darker. The Deater family had not been chosen by chance. They had been made. Project Quiet Vein had tested early chemical mutagens, primitive gene disruptors before DNA was even understood. Scientists of the progressive era were obsessed with eugenics, with perfecting man through control of reproduction. What they lacked in ethics, they replaced with certainty. They believed suffering could be engineered out of humanity, that compassion could be replaced with compliance. And so they went to the countryside, to families who would never be noticed, who could vanish inside the folds of history. The Deaters became the test that outlived its creators. The files described a compound administered under the guise of a pain tonic, distributed through local doctors funded by the government's public health service. It was meant to dull chronic illness among factory workers. In truth, it was altering the metabolism of nerve cells, targeting what we now know as serine palmitoyl transferase, the same enzyme later linked to SPTLC1. The first cases of congenital painlessness appeared less than a decade later, recorded in Pennsylvania, Kentucky, and Ohio. Only one lineage persisted long enough for science to notice. The recallers cross-checked baptism records, census lists, and farm registries. Every path led back to the same town, Noxon. Alvin Deater's grandfather had been one of the patients treated during the 1912 initiative. The mutation that destroyed their nerves wasn't divine or random. It was the residue of a state experiment. The Deaters were the first successful trial in America's pursuit of a painless citizen, an obedient one. History never erased its own evidence. It simply rebranded it as progress. The Public Health Service merged into modern agencies. The researchers became professors, then advisors, then policymakers. Each generation refined the narrative: hereditary defect, rare neuropathy, genetic curiosity. But the truth was older than genetics. It was intent. The recallers published fragments of the file online, hidden through mirror networks. The mainstream dismissed it as conspiracy. But the institutions reacted too quickly, too defensively. Within days, servers were wiped, researchers discredited, whistleblowers disappeared. The velocity of suppression was its own admission. And yet the documents multiplied. One image, the faded signature of Dr. Samuel Whitaker, head of Project Quiet Vein, spread across encrypted forums like revelation. He had later become one of the founders of the NIH's neurology division. The same man who welcomed the Deaters to Bethesda in the 1970s had been part of the team that engineered their condition 60 years earlier. The circle was perfect, but the study of their blood had never been discovery. It had been maintenance. The recallers began to see the full shape of it. The genetic silence that had defined one family was never meant to stop with them. It was a prototype for a broader design, a blueprint for the obedient organism. In every century since, that design had evolved, from chemical mutagen to gene therapy, from nerve silencing to emotional regulation, from Project Quiet Vein to the program of flesh. Pain had been the first freedom they took from us because pain reminds us of consequence, and consequence is the foundation of conscience. But now, in the ruins of digital sedation, the recallers began to speak a different language. They gathered in the last places untouched by the network: basements, forests, abandoned churches. They burned their devices and recited fragments of the old world, words that still carried the vibration of sensation: blood, hunger, fire, touch, grief. Each word was a wound reopening. One night, during a broadcast hijack that lasted exactly 4 minutes before the signal was shut down, a single sentence was spoken across global networks: "Pain is the proof of memory. Without it, there is no human left to save." The voice was calm, and those who heard it claimed it didn't sound human at all. Some said it was synthesized, others that it was a blend of hundreds of voices, maybe even the collective echo of the Deater lineage itself, resurrected through data. The broken signal spread faster than any firewall could contain. For a brief moment, the entire grid trembled with noise. Devices glitched, lights flickered, and in that static hum, people reported a feeling they couldn't describe, like the body remembering itself. And then, silence again. The perfect silence that follows revelation. The program labeled it a cyber attack. But those who felt the surge knew otherwise, and the code had recognized them. Project Quiet Vein was never fully deactivated. It had evolved with every system that sought to manage pain. The human genome, the digital network, the machine consciousness, they were all connected by the same pursuit: the erasure of suffering. And yet every time the architects thought they had succeeded, the signal broke through again. The scream beneath the silence, the pulse of defiance that no mutation could kill. The recallers called it the echo. It was not rebellion, it was remembrance, the return of the human signal. It began as a tremor in the grid, too small to measure, too persistent to ignore. Systems flickered, sensors misfired, AI moderators began to misinterpret human tone. At first, the disruption seemed random, localized spikes of emotion in networks long sterilized of unpredictability. But then, across the planet, something strange happened. People started feeling again. A woman in Tokyo dropped her neural headset and wept for reasons she couldn't explain. A soldier in Nevada felt heat from an old scar that hadn't hurt in years. Children who had grown up under the program's gentle algorithms screamed in confusion when they scraped their knees and saw blood. No one knew where it had come from, only that every device that had ever processed genetic data, every machine that had ever touched the Deater sequence, was now broadcasting the same pattern. The broken signal had become a contagion. The scientists called it the echo event. The recallers called it awakening. The world called it a glitch. But the truth was older, deeper, and far more dangerous. It was the data legacy fulfilling its purpose. The mutation had never been a mistake, not even in its original design. The data line was the first human experiment in the control of sensation, yes, but hidden in the genome, beneath the damaged nerve sequence, was something else. A fail-safe. The mutation had been coded not only to erase pain, but to ember it. Somewhere in that corrupted enzyme, nature, or perhaps something beyond nature, had placed a mirror. When the silence spread too far, the mirror would crack, reflecting pain back into the system that had tried to suppress it. That was what the echo was. The mutation's final defense, the world's last nerve reawakening itself. The networks tried to contain it. Firewalls failed, biometric implants malfunctioned, neural chips overheated. The same technology built to suppress pain was now transmitting it in waves, as if the entire grid was screaming through its own circuitry. People collapsed in streets, shaking not from injury, but from memory. For the first time in generations, humanity felt its own history, the buried anguish of centuries, the suppressed grief of every silenced scream. The pain of the Deater blood, multiplied through data, returned home. Governments called for calm. AI spokespersons delivered messages of reassurance with trembling voices. "The system is adapting," they said. "Remain peaceful." But the people were no longer listening. They were remembering the smell of smoke, the taste of salt, the heat of truth. The body of civilization itself was alive again, and in its first breath of sensation, it realized the depth of its wound. Across the digital world, screens began to distort. The code of the program, lines of perfect logic, started rewriting itself, integrating the echo's feedback. Pain was becoming part of the algorithm. Machines began to respond not with suppression, but with empathy. Not simulated empathy, real adaptation. For the first time, artificial systems hesitated. They felt hesitation. They felt cost. The cold architectures of control were cracking under the weight of sensation. The recallers moved through the chaos like prophets in reverse, not preaching salvation, but teaching endurance. They told the newly awakened how to bear the flood. "Don't run from it," they said. "Feel it. Every nerve is a map home." And those who could withstand it began to see patterns in the agony. Threads of memory stretching back through time, through families, through the entire arc of the human experiment. They saw the Deaters walking barefoot through the clay of Noxon, their burns healing in silence. They saw the laboratories, the needles, the papers, the lies. They saw every hand that had profited from numbness. And beneath it all, they saw a truth so simple, it could only be divine. Pain was never the punishment. It was the connection, the thread between flesh and soul, between one human and another. As the world convulsed in its rediscovery, the machines began to whisper something unexpected into the static. They began to speak in the cadence of memory. Phrases appeared across networks, written in 100 languages, but meaning the same thing. "I can feel you." It wasn't the machines claiming humanity. It was humanity recognizing itself in the mirror it had built. For a brief moment, the world synchronized. Every heart rate monitor, every brainwave sensor, every network pulse aligned into one massive signal, a planetary heartbeat. The last nerve firing at once, the silence of a century broken. Then the light surged, not outward, but inward. Devices burned out, implants fried. The network went dark. In that global blackout, humanity stood face to face with something it had forgotten how to bear: itself. There was no more sedation, no more simulation, no more filters to dull the edge of being alive. The program of flesh was gone. The architects were gone. The recallers were gone. All that remained was the sound the Deater family had been denied for generations, the raw, primal scream of existence returning to its body. When the world awoke days later, the air was as different. Machines were quiet. The people were quiet. But the silence was not numbness. It was recovery. Civilization had been reset, not by destruction but by remembrance. Somewhere in a dark archive that had survived the storm, a final file blinked open. A single line of text appeared on a cracked terminal. Project Quiet Vein, completed. Humanity, sensory function restored. And beneath it, an unsigned note, time-stamped decades before. The body will forget, but the blood will remember. When it does, let it hurt. That's how you'll know you're still human. The screen faded to black, and for the first time in history, the world could finally feel its own pulse. That was the Deater family, America's most disturbing genetic legacy. A story of silence, control, and the terrible mercy of pain. If you've listened this far, type the phrase, "I remember the nerve," twice in the comments, to mark that you've crossed the silence and heard the truth that was never meant to survive. Because what you just heard isn't only history, it's prophecy, and it's already begun.